Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Spencer Marley, and I'm a Solutions Manager for AWS in the public sector. I'm based out of Singapore for today. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Festival of Innovation and our Fireside chat on Rebuilding for Good, which is the last session in this year's festival. For the next half an hour, we'll be talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been at the forefront of everyone's minds now for almost 2 years. I'm delighted to say that today I'm joined by Dr. Piret, Tõnurist, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, and Jonathan Wong. Dr. Piret, over to you for a quick introduction.
My name is Piret Tõnurist, and I am the Program Manager of Anticipatory Innovation Governance at the OECD's Observatory of Public Sector Innovation.
Thanks, Dr. Piret. And Jonathan, over to you for an introduction.
Thanks, Spencer. I'm Jonathan Wong. I'm the Chief of Technology Innovation at the United Nations Commission for Asia and the Pacific, based out of Bangkok. Just so you can place what I'm going to say today, but my job is to advise governments on technology innovation policy, covering 62 countries in Asia Pacific, kind of going as far west as Turkey, far south east as Pacific. So quite broad. Thanks, Spencer.
Awesome. Great to have you both here today. We've got lots of questions, so let's get started. I'll come to you, Dr. Piret, first for the first question. I'd like to ask you about anticipatory innovation governance. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and why it's important as we rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you very much. So most people are familiar with futures and foresight or thinking about the long-term future, but there's a big impact gap in terms of how governments actually use futures, foresight, and this kind of knowledge about what's coming up, in a sense that it doesn't really tend to land in policies or innovations. It doesn't inform things. So governments tend to end up with end-of-the-pipe solutions, so reacting when things have already gotten bad. And in many cases, we saw that happening in the current pandemic as well, in a sense that we were in the tactical adaptive mode rather than that we had foreseen or anticipated things. So anticipatory innovation governance is really about making governments proactive. And here we use insights, of course, from futures and foresight, but it's really about making a decision based on that is informing our actions today. So an easy example for that is going to be, well, you have a forecast about how much it's going to rain the next day. Then you have to make a decision based on that knowledge. Am I taking an umbrella or not? Or if you are very ambitious, you can also innovate and change the weather forecast of tomorrow, because some countries too also have innovations to change weather. If you want it to rain more or rain less, depending on an important event that is coming up, for example. So it's actually taking decisions based on future knowledge and taking that into action and innovation, and having a governance system that actually supports that. And that is not in place at the moment in many countries, but not only with the current pandemic, but with the upcoming complexity and volatility of different events, both technologically oriented or climate oriented, we actually need that anticipation and action in practice from government side as well.
Fascinating. And are there any practical examples you can talk about with regards to the pandemic, or things that you anticipate might come up?
Well, I mean, the pandemic actually created a lot of different avenues where we can anticipate towards. There are a lot of cascading effects from the pandemic. The pandemic itself has accelerated the use of technology in different ways. So what we can also see is that the previous predictions of future work, for example, might have been now fraudulent, that we might actually get to highly distributed work conditions or hybrid conditions much faster than before, which also calls us to innovate much more faster in our organizations to respond to that in both technological and digital terms, to make conditions to make that happen. But also in a kind of social economic effects that the rollout or the speedy rollout that the technology now is going to demand from organizations.
Perfect. Jonathan, anything to add to that one?
Just thanks, Piret, for saying what you just said, because I learned something about anticipatory governance today, but back and link to Foresight's important. On the question of why it's important, I think the system's inadequate, quite frankly. I mean, you look at the two biggest shocks to our, certainly within my generation, within our lifetime. So take the 2008 financial crisis. We have a stock exchange which has the most sophisticated, data-driven, real-time, both key traits of anticipatory governance models, one of the most sophisticated ones in the world. Traders use this all the time. They're forecasting to the future. Boom, financial crisis happens. No one sees it coming. Similar to COVID. No one saw that coming. I think that's why it's so important. I mean, it's another question to unpack whether it's possible to. I mean, maybe I'll talk about this. I know some of the other questions coming up around whether it is indeed possible to have foresight, which is a more philosophical question. But I think certainly the systems are inadequate, and we've seen that with the two biggest shocks that hit us in the past 20 years. I think what's interesting is, and Piret touched upon this as well, that government's having to react quickly because of a lack of anticipatory processes or indeed foresight. And you're certainly seeing that with like COVID vaccinations as an example. I used to work in healthcare innovation, and you're seeing much more aggressive, shorter timelines around things like vaccination regulation and vaccination approvals. So I think that's really an interesting area to also look at in the context of this agenda. If you don't quite get the foresight right, you're not anticipating right, actually sometimes you need to react. So I think this area of kind of agile governance, if you like, should be in the same conversation as these other two governance areas as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, so you may not be able to predict exactly what's around the corner, but if you have that agile framework or methodologies, then you can adapt to whatever it is. Yeah. Awesome. Thinking next about the use of technology in economic recovery. What opportunities, and perhaps I'll come to Jonathan first here, what opportunities and challenges do you think COVID-19 has presented in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, many. I mean, of course, I'm biased, but I think that there are very few bright spots during the pandemic, but one of them has been kind of the rapid digital transformation that's happened everywhere around us, which has frankly done my job for me within my organization. You're pushing people to use digital, they have no choice now. And if you look from a government perspective, I mean, digital supported e-health solutions, education solutions, distribution of social protection to populations. From a more economic perspective, I suppose everyone knows companies and businesses, both formal, informal, large, medium, small, those that have had access to things like e-commerce, digital finance, have fared much, much better, being able to kind of be more resilient during the pandemic. So I think that there's the big kind of opportunity, if you like, and why it's been important. I mean, the biggest issue in Asia Pacific is that many, many people have been left behind. I mean, everyone on this call today has access to the digital world. Otherwise, we wouldn't be on this call.
Yeah.
2 billion people in the Asia Pacific region do not have access to the digital world and internet connectivity. I mean, it's really hard to imagine 2 billion. That's half the population of the Asia Pacific region. And I think the biggest challenge for us through this rapid digital transformation is to leave no one behind in many respects, and not to accentuate even greater inequalities in the digital world that are kind of present in the physical world as we have it at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just adding to that as well is that there are huge inequalities that we see happening as well, but huge possibilities that COVID has also opened. So it's a very kind of unequal crisis in that sense, because we see also kind of the opening up of data and cross-fertilization of data that has now accelerated across the board, also in governments, that they have become more open in terms of the kind of the data releases. And what is also kind of an upcoming trend is kind of this real-time evaluation or real-time economics to actually see the trends happening. While in the private sector, it was already kind of emerging, but especially kind of this gray zone between private and public sector, that you can see also the move towards real-time evaluation of policy using digital means, and the connected opportunities to actually be more agile or be more kind of proactive in many different ways. And of course, a really big area where there's a lot of inequality as well, that the crisis has made a possibility, is the green transition, because it really has shown that it is possible to reduce emissions, but there has to be quite a big leap in terms of technological development and how we live our lives as well to actually get to those carbon neutrality position that we want to see happening. So there's a lot of room for businesses and companies to actually develop those aims as well.
Jonathan, coming back to you on your point about, I guess, reducing inequalities and preventing people being left behind, like practically, what do you think that means? Is that internet access to smart devices, and how do we make that possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very easy thing to say, isn't it, really? But let me give you some kind of practical examples on actually how we're working with governments on this. So we always say within my team, kind of inclusion has to be at the heart of digital policy, strategies and plans if the promise of leaving no one behind is to be met. So what does that mean in practice? To give a few examples, in Mongolia, we worked with the government on the first ever digital strategy, which had very, I don't, people may or may not, the population makeup of Mongolia, very, very centered on the capital, but a massive rural population. And within that digital strategy, we put very deliberate targets, very specific strategies, and very deliberate plans on actually reaching these rural communities. Similarly, in Cambodia, we recently worked on their science, technology, innovation roadmap. And again, very specific objectives, indicators, targets around engaging more women in the digital world. And even with the private sector, I mean, you mentioned digital economy. I mentioned earlier that many people and many businesses have fared better during the pandemic because they had access to e-commerce and digital finance. Now, I take an example of, there was a startup we funded called She Investments in Cambodia, where a big problem for women entrepreneurs in the informal sector is that they can't get access to finance to grow their businesses. So we worked with this tech startup called She Investments, which I call it a very cool app on a very uncool topic. It was an app that just allowed women with no financial literacy or no digital skills to be able to keep their financing records on an app. Very simple. Now, what did this allow them to do? It allowed them to kind of go to the banks, with financial records, all of that sort of stuff, so that they could gain access. So yeah, I mean, these are some of the very practical steps. I think policies just need to be more deliberate and strategic and have specific indicators around inclusion. Both inclusion in terms of who benefits, but also inclusion in terms of who's engaged in the process of policy making. And for the private sector, I mean, yeah, you're seeing it. There's a big opportunity, particularly for tech startups looking to engage women, like the example I just gave you, because they really are an untapped dividend in terms of entrepreneurs within the Asia Pacific region. Thanks, Spencer.
Perfect. Thinking now more about some of the innovations that have come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. How can we keep this momentum going beyond that? And perhaps you can talk a little bit about some of your favorite innovations that you've seen and come across. Dr. Piret, come to you first on that one.
Uh-huh. So I think it's a difficult question as well, is that regardless of how we want this innovation momentum to keep going, there will be a little bit of innovation fatigue. Like, we're also getting tired of only meeting up online and having online festivals. There will also be kind of a slowdown of innovations in governments as well when the crisis falls down. So it's really about the first part of the question of how to keep that going. It's how do we actually institutionalize some of these opportunities that were given to governments to innovate during these periods, and creating missions or ambitious missions that create room for more innovation for the future coming from the crisis itself, like green recovery and the green transition, to name a few. But my favorite kind of innovations, I have to say that most of the innovations have been quite tactical in many ways, that there have been immediate responses or kind of applying off-the-shelf technologies that didn't get used before. But I have to say that the huge wave of kind of community innovations that has come from the crisis itself, in terms of community responses or community level, also digital and technological developments that have been coming up across the board in OECD countries and beyond. And the kind of the diversity of those innovations is quite interesting. A lot of them have been especially about giving information, like communication-oriented innovations that Jonathan was also talking about, is that actually to give access to different points on a digital format or different formats. But there have been also quite a lot of social innovations that have been coming up in the COVID times, where actually the communities are taking responsibility and help out their kind of social disadvantaged people or people who require different sources of knowledge. So I tend to kind of gravitate towards those types of innovations, while of course seeing the rollout of robotics and robot dogs or different testing methods and IoT solutions for actually tracking kind of movement of people have also been very exciting to see. But looking forward to kind of these long-term effects of the innovations themselves and see where it goes.
Yeah, I've certainly seen those robot dogs roaming around in Singapore.
Yes.
Jonathan, how about yourself? What have been your favorite innovations that you've seen, and how do we keep the momentum going?
My favorite one's really less cool. I go back to this point around kind of agile regulation. What we've seen during the pandemic is, again, within healthcare and vaccines in particular, just the regulatory process being really looked at and people innovating that process. You know, how do we make it quicker, still safeguarding social protections of the public, etc. And for me, that has so much applicability to really fuel innovation at a mass scale in so many different sectors. I'll give an example. A friend of mine works at the Bank of England, and they were looking at digital currencies and fintech. And he was saying to me, Jonathan, the reason people say we're lagging behind on the regulation in this area is not because we don't understand it. It's because the regulatory process is so bureaucratic. You know, we can't. So, and this goes back to the point. If that was more agile, how could we could move forward so much quicker on a whole range of different areas? I mean, you look at climate change and climate technologies. How could we shrink and make more lean the regulatory process around these things so that we could adopt these climate technologies that are much needed? I think the second thing I would say is, maybe it's not an innovation, is that you've seen the urgency in the innovation space that the COVID-19 pandemic has created. And my hope is that this urgency could be really placed on some of the biggest challenges that we're going to face beyond COVID-19, climate change being one of them. Imagine if we had this amount of urgency around climate change. It could be a game changer, especially with COP26 coming up. So there would be 2 points I would make.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue into the next question, actually. So as we're looking to the road to recovery, it also does present an opportunity for governments to build back and greener. What's your advice to governments looking to do so? Jonathan, first, please.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I work for the UN, and obviously we have COP26 coming up in Scotland quite soon. I mean, for me, it's simple. I think governments have to be wildly ambitious with their COP26 commitments, and importantly, stick to them and implement them. Simple as that.
Mm-hmm. On my side as well is that I think that the ambitious, committing to ambitious goals is the starting point. But then there's a very difficult road after that, which is, as was said by one of my great Finnish colleagues, is that good ideas, implementation is where good ideas go to die. So you actually have to build a system that can actually deliver on those missions as well. That are that you don't start to mission wash to say, well, we're already doing this and this and this, so everybody's doing something on climate. But are you actually reaching the goal based on your status quo activities? So it's really about looking over systematically your responses, as well as that, are we also ambitious enough in terms of the implementation and how we work, for example, how our regulation works or our budgeting system works, to actually give us the information about, are we actually reaching those goals? Do we have a complete picture about this portfolio that we are wanting to achieve? So putting those systems in place as well to support the climate action is extremely important. So for example, Finland is looking into phenomenon-based budgeting. So actually budget through the budget measures to direct very ambitious goals, and also make people across government to work together towards that goal, rather than just say, I'm going to give a little bit of money to this organization and this organization and this organization, and then you figure it out and we're going to get there. Unfortunately, the previous experience has shown us that this doesn't happen. So it's also something that in the OECD, we are building a missions action lab to actually accompany some of these ambitious missions on the ground with countries and other ecosystem partners to actually see them, how we can actually fulfill them and what kind of tools, methods, and methodologies are needed on the ground to make it happen.
Yeah. And I'd like to ask you both as well, where you see the split, the divide between the role that government should play and corporations and citizens. Like, how do you delineate that?
Well, if I can, I can start. And I would say that the starting point is the one that cares the most. I don't have a particular preference about who does what. I've worked with systems change and transformations for over 15 years already. And I usually find my partner, the first partner in any kind of journey, about who is the most motivated to actually make it happen. So if it's a public problem or public value problem, or you actually want to get there and have your motivated partners in government, then let's figure out how to activate the whole ecosystem to make it happen. Governments don't usually make things happen on their own. They actually need to activate others and accelerate other partners to do so. If there is no actor present in the public sector, then we can find one in the third sector or private sector to lead on things. And to be honest, when things become big enough and influential enough, then usually government comes on board later on as well. So it is really about the very kind of mercurial or pragmatic approach to getting things done in terms of also division between sectors.
It's a really interesting question. I put myself in the position of a citizen now, rather than someone in the UN who works for the government. It's so easy. Often, you blame the government for this, you blame the private sector for that, but actually, you have a lot of accountability too. I mean, certainly, I think governments, taking climate change, can set the rules of the game for business. In many Pacific islands, they ban single-use plastics. Once you do that, business has to pivot and go greener. You look in the UK, where they're banning, I think, electric vehicles by 2030 or 2050. Boom, that changes whole industries. But businesses also listen to their customers. And I think all of us have that, if you like, obligation and indeed power to actually shift business behavior by actually demanding products that are climate friendly, all these sorts of things that are sustainable. And we all have that within us. So yeah, I think I think governments and the private sector get bad press sometimes. I think everyone on this webinar today has a role to play in this, because our voice counts and collectively can actually shift markets and shift behaviors as well.
Yeah, very interesting. We've got just a few minutes left and a couple more questions that I want to get through. The next one is how we think about encouraging agility. We talked about that before, and innovation as well, but in the civil servants themselves. How do you think we go about doing that, Jonathan?
That's a hard question. I used to be a civil servant. I think Piret's a specialist in this area, so I'm sure she'll go into a lot more. I mean, for me, I think there's the conditions. So the leadership's got to be on board with the idea of actually genuinely changing, not just saying it publicly or for internal marketing. I think you need the resources as well. Very often the resources aren't there, be it in terms of human capital, the type of skills you need within government, the types of people you bring into government. I always look to job specs, even within the UN, and saying, why are you always looking for economists and political scientists? Shouldn't we be looking for artists, designers, poets, blah, 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 blah. This is how you get these different kind of perspectives that really bring a different perspective to a problem, and that's how innovation happens. I think certainly there's something around the incentives. I mean, I used to work in a venture capital fund. My incentive was make money. If I made money, I got a big bonus. You don't have that within the private sector. So in the public sector. So maybe incentives is difficult, but maybe take away some of the disincentives, like don't slam people if they fail, things like this. And thirdly, just be as agile as possible. It's sometimes like trawling through treacle in government to get something done. And there are many, many very innovative civil servants who get bogged down with this. So just being I mentioned it earlier, being agile, sharper, and leaner in processes to take that space away and take that brain power away to allow civil servants to innovate would be kind of some of the ideas that I would put forward. But again, very simple to say, very, very difficult to do.
Very much so indeed. And I mean, there is huge amount of discussion and huge amount of factors that actually influence individuals and their innovativeness. But overall, the point I would like to make that I don't meet, I usually interact with the most innovative groups of civil servants. And I have to say that I don't meet bad people in the public sector. I meet a lot of people who are extremely smart based on the fact that they do what really caters to the success of their career development in the public sector. And usually the being more innovative or agile is not one of the feedback systems that is evaluated, or regardless of their incentives. Because I mean, a lot of people go into the public service not for the big bonus, but actually to solve problems. But how many of us get to solve big problems, or that to be part of our job or job's description? Like, how many times are you asked within your performance evaluation description, did you solve this problem, or did you engage in innovation, or do these kind of things? It happens almost never in the public sector, you know. And when you start to think about that, it's like how to activate with the right kind of support systems, incentive systems, really, really smart people who know how to actually get ahead in the system. Like, why couldn't be agility and innovation part of that matrix?
Perfect. I think we've got time for just one final question. Thinking about now the sustainability and inclusive side, how can we get governments to use foresight and future thinking to plan for sustainability and inclusive tech development, again, beyond the pandemic? I'll come to Piret first.
Is she frozen? Oh, no, she's back.
Okay.
I think we all were questioning if we were frozen, but I think I can kind of start off by answering the question, is that how to actually integrate vision and foresight into the processes is to start doing it, and start doing it to look at and not only look at it about what we're going to do in 10 years' times, but also using it as a kind of a stress testing and wind tunneling model of your current policies. So we're doing actually a lot of projects across countries from Slovenia to Finland to Ireland to actually exactly do that, to look at what the technological change, what the assumptions about the technological change are, and how it may actually influence our policies, approaches today, and actually connect that to a kind of a prototyping innovation process or experimentation process to say, well, if we are going to be in a decentralized platform, digital economy type of working situation, like what could be actually, what does that mean for talent management, for example, in Slovenia or otherwise? And a lot of countries already have very ambitious programs in terms of Aurora AI program in Finland, or technology dialogues or others, where those insights are kind of integrated into government approaches, but also specific policies. But my advice is start doing it right away, because it will make your policies more robust and dynamic, and the government also more ambitious in terms of the kind of actions they take.
Perfect. I'll come over to Jonathan for a response there.
Sure. I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to ask about foresight, given my skepticism to some extent. I mean, I mentioned the financial crash and COVID as well, but I think another example. I mean, without giving away my age, I remember when I first was shown the internet, and who could have imagined kind of the world we live in today? It would have been very few people with that foresight to see where it could go. But what I would say is governments have the power to direct the direction and the ambition of particularly the private sector development of technology for more inclusive and sustainable outcomes. I'll give an example of what I mean by that. Taking Thailand, where I lived, I worked on a Social Enterprise Act. Now, this is an act that gives investors 100% tax break on investments in enterprises that have an ingrained social purpose. I think governments, I mentioned the electric cars in the UK and single-use plastics in the Pacific Islands. You can set the direction by doing that straight away. In ASEAN, we worked with the ASEAN Secretariat on a set of inclusive business guidelines. Now, what is inclusive business? Inclusive businesses are businesses that provide products and services to the very poorest people and provide income opportunities to them. And in the Philippines, as an example, they have an inclusive business accreditation scheme that gives businesses tax breaks if they can prove those things. So there are so many of these types of policies that can actually direct the tech sector towards those inclusive and sustainable outcomes, maybe alongside foresight. And I think that shouldn't be forgotten in many ways if we are indeed to kind of make sure this sector does contribute to SDGs and all the kind of grand challenges and issues that we're facing during COVID and I'm sure beyond as well. Thanks, Spencer.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Well, if there's a little bit of time, like a two minutes time, if you can give me, I would like to address Jonathan's skepticism of foresight.
I thought you might.
Because the point wasn't to say that actually every scenario is going to be wrong because we cannot predict the future, and it's not forecasting. Forecasting tries to simulate based on current data what is going to come up, and that's the problem in a sense that in stable conditions forecasting works. When we're dealing with high level of uncertainty, it doesn't. And to be honest, all the crises, including the pandemic and 2008 crisis as well, there were foresight and futures people and also economists who saw those crises coming. They were not just those types of scenarios, but deemed too unlikely to take into account. So actually, there were people that saw all of this coming, and there were scenarios in place to actually deal with them, but nothing was done with them as such. So the role of strategic foresight is not about predicting the future. It is about seeing and raising the possibility, making a possible scenario or kind of a wind tunneling approach based on that, and being prepared for the possibility rather than saying this is definitely going to happen.
Perfect.
No, she's right.
Well, I'm sure we could talk for hours on this topic. Unfortunately, we're going to have to call it a day for now because we've run out of time. I'd like to say thank you very much to our panelists, Dr. Piret and Jonathan, for joining us today. It's been really enjoyable. Thank you to all of our audience for making the time for it. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and we'll see you again next year.